I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on failure, and the nature of this video will be a proposition on it will be predicated or centered around a thought I am having on the proposition of educational reform. There are several items of interest for legislators, for educators, for parents, and for even students per se in this, but I've not heard this proposed, and so it's something that I propose in terms of the recasting of what we conceive education to be. Very really in the American public educational system, what we try to do is create reproducible performances over time. We want students to be able to recite information and get it right over and over and over again, and we want them to use the information and the already made patterns and expectations of whatever field and domain that the knowledge belongs to. Now, the problem I have with this is that that only leads to one type of learning, and it only produces one type of thought, and that the individuals who can think and think for themselves are an exceptional minority and are rare, particularly because because the school system is set up this way, and that we think education should be a process of success and not one of failure. And it is so innate to the system itself that our grading system is set up for people who make A's to get to the top, and people who receive F's in terms of scores and letter grades to be held back or revised, because it's the idea of perfecting static knowledge structures that is at the heart of education. It's inundation and induction and essentially brainwashing that's at the heart of education. Now, what is it that I'm proposing that we change about this? And it's that we should very much invert that pyramid. That if you're succeeding at least at a 90% rate, we need to make things harder for that individual. I think that there should be a feedback mechanism in the education system itself, to where failure is the norm and passing is the exception. Failure is the norm, passing is the exception. That's how I see it and I think about it. Very really, this can only work in one way, and there is really only one way I conceive education. I think that education works in its most generalist form at the earliest years, per se, in this, that kids should learn how to read, write, basically not read and write, but read, use grammar, learn how to use grammar and what proper syntax is, basic mathematics in terms of pre-algebra skills, and I mentioned reading already, and formal logic, economics, and basic economics, and yeah, I said formal logic, basic economic principles, and the scientific method and art. Those are essentially the things that kids should be learning how to do things with when they're in primary school and when they're in their early educational programs. I think that that is the majority of what they should be doing, and that's all that they really should be doing. They shouldn't be doing much more than that and really mastering those things. It's at those levels where you want, I think, from the ages of 4 to about 10 years old, that you want reproducible, consistent performance, because you want them to perfect a certain palette of knowledge. But that palette should be built upon and extended as they go on to where it's not really in the educational system. It's just that continual perfectionistic loop, per se, that makes people, that inundates people and gets them into very fixed, tracked mindsets and ways of thinking, to where you stifle creativity, per se, and you really prevent people from developing the ability to think for themselves. The only reason that you have individuals in the end that come out doing that with the way things are set up is because they either have extenuating circumstances, or they are exceptionally gifted. And there is too much of a loss in human capital and talent right now, to where the issues and the challenges that we're going to deal with, per se, in our very immediate future, by way of various looming economic crises and ecological crises and all kinds of fun crises that are on the horizon for the Western frontier. We only need more capable people who can actually think about things and do something about issues and actually solve some problems. I think that the generality and the universality of learning is only important at the very early ages, though specificity and specialization should happen far sooner than it does right now. It's a shame and a travesty that graduate school is what it is right now, and that students do not really get to perfect, or not perfect, but don't get to master any domains of knowledge unless they have parents that push them to do so, or unless they're prodigies, or unless for very real extra circumstances that most people do not get to experience. I think that very really the education system does not take and affirm people in their motivational schemas and in the ways that they derive meaning and purpose. Mastery and autonomy are chief driving engines in terms of human motivation, and schools completely overlook that and disavow that. Children should specialize, and they would be better off specializing and becoming masters at whatever it is that they're interested in at early ages, and establishing themselves within communities and peers of like minds, values, and interests, per se, and being plugged into communities of older individuals within those collective fields and domains of knowledge, to where there's a true nurturing dynamic, to where the fields are propagating and building themselves up from and making good artists, musicians, writers, mathematicians, scientists, all in all, throughout the entirety of one's life and existence, particularly because in a Western culture, the ability to contribute to a field and to a domain, per se, whether that is in a corporation or an academic subject, is very, very important. Our entire fiscal reward system is based upon it. We are in a society where we must present value to a marketplace, and we must bring capital in. And if we are to do these things, if these things are to happen, we have to better equip people, per se, in the attainment of such things. And I think that that happens when we first say that people should be able to specialize, and education should not be this universal idealization of the polymath per se. That's when we get what we want per se, and individuals who can think about a subject and who can be inventive and creative with it, and how you get communities that have more diversity and hardiness to them per se, and a greater pool of talent that can be spread out into multiple differing job sets and structures and whatnot. Now, the thing is, though, that the emphasis on success is completely derailing to this thing. People only learn through challenge. School is too much of trying. Right now, schools are so much of trying to be pleasant experiences for kids, to where they should take a note from like Russian ballet instructors. There's nothing nice about learning and about becoming exceptionally good at something. The problem is that very really kids are not allowed to specialize and therefore be motivated and pursue their interests, and they are not challenged sufficiently enough. They are given an insurmountable amount of tasks and busy work per se to complete and to do, but they are not asked to become more than what they are, and they're not asked to consider more than what is readily available to them within text and what's already present in established fields of concretized knowledge and procedural knowledge. We don't ask them to do that, but very really we need that type of thinking and the ability and wherewithal for those things in more than just highly gifted individuals. And the only way you get such things is by creating environments that do nurture these things. And it is the inversion of success towards a maximum of failure that you get this. When things are sufficiently stressful, you do get sufficient adaptations out of people. The thing is that we want students to we want the best students to pass a 90% at a 90% rate, and we think that the best students should be doing good on 90% of the things that they get. I think that the best students should only be doing good on 15 to 20% of the work that they receive. I think that that's what the best students should be doing. A 20 at certain levels, a 20%. That is how things should go. That's how hard things should be. And if you play music, because anytime you want a good performer or somebody who can think about the field or the domain of knowledge itself, there is a steep learning curve for that skill. Or if you want to call it a skill, I don't know what you want to call it, but there's a steep learning curve to actually being a musician. There's a steep learning curve to actually being a mathematician. There is a steep learning curve to being a physicist or whatever you want to call it. When you finally do real whatever it is, but when you get into university, if you get into a good university per se, that's not even getting into a good university. I think most people who go to college realize this, that it's different than going to school, in high school, and not simply because the term is shorter, but because the cognitive demand is higher. And that's what I have a problem with. The cognitive demand should be high from the very get-go. There is this disavowal per se, or I would say underestimation of what a highly motivated person can do when you allow them to focus on what they're interested in per se. They do not have to be extraordinarily intelligent. And if this is a process that continues on from very early ages per se, and trying to make them as exceptional as you can make them through an inundation of failure and continually meeting metrics of creative value and delayed gratification, that we would get what we wanted at the end of the tunnel, and that would be individuals who can contribute and truly bring value to a marketplace, and don't need to be trained per se when they get out of college to, do whatever, how to think about whatever it is they're supposed to think about. That's, it's just ridiculous that when people get out of college, that's when they learn to think about things. You should be learning how to think about things from the time you are, 4 years old, really. That's what we need, per se. And it's just that I think that the idea of failure, and more failure is much more conducive to what, Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. I don't know because I haven't read her work. I just hear people throwing that around so often. So I don't know a lot about it, and I don't know what I think about it per se. I don't know the underlying assumptions that she's making in those things, and I haven't read her research or anything like that. But I do hear in education that there is this idea and this tendency more to view learning something as a process. I would say, to add on to that expertise is a process, and you cannot get exceptional, you can't get brilliant, you can't get genius everywhere, but you can get experts that are pretty damn good, and in a collective sense are very good at being collaborative and contributing to the advancement of fields and their central efficacy, and would be able to help solve, because we need pools and teams of people that are capable to solve the problems that are for sure going to hit us in our immediate future, because of our actions of the past, and our lack of wisdom. I think that the demand for capable individuals is going to only skyrocket, per se, and the revision of the educational system is going to be necessary to meet this demand. Something else I hear all the time, which is a side note, is that we need to raise standards. Well, you think? I've never heard a good argument for lowering them. But I think that we're trying to do it in the wrong direction. To whereas I don't understand why the hell you don't need a master's or a PhD to teach somebody a subject. If you're not a master of your subject, this always baffled me. I could give a proof for the Pythagorean identity, or the Pythagorean theorem, not the Pythagorean identity, but I could give a proof for the Pythagorean theorem when I was 12 years old. I had a proof that I learned and that I used to have, and I still like this proof. Well, I have a different proof now for it because it doesn't require as many triangles and stuff. But anyways, I was more visual when I was a kid. I like algebra more now. But anyways, I had a proof, and I asked my geometry teacher to show me her proof, and she didn't have one. That, why do we think it's acceptable for just anybody to teach children mathematics? If you wanted your kids to learn piano, per se, you wouldn't just give them to anybody. You'd give them to somebody who really knew how to play the piano and was a master of playing the piano, or at least an expert and capable and competent in playing the piano. And competent in more than just passing educational placement test or CBAS or teaching credentials or single subject credential or whatever the hell have you. It's ridiculous, the level of ability of teachers in classrooms. That really brilliant teachers are the exception and not the norm. It's gosh, what do you think you're going to get then from the pool of students that you're given? But also that, because if you want it to be where students fail really all the time, then there has to be some sort of other buttress and mechanism, and that has to be because the information that they're receiving is so cognitively robust that it's going to take them a long time to deal with, and they can't possibly assimilate all the pieces at one time. You need individuals who can actually disseminate those things in the most efficient manners and create ways for students to fail per se, and then create ways for them to succeed at least in the 30% range, so they don't completely give up. But you know, we need to make it to where students do fail, and that we force people to fail, and that people do realize that there is the complexity of the world, and that they be faced with novelty. And I promise you, kids will be much more keen to pay attention and like that more so than what they're receiving now in education. And you would not have this problem of a complete lack of engagement by students. At least I don't think. And that's just an idea I have on educational reform, that it should be more so striving towards mastery, and not these cheap metrics of valedictorians and standards and things that we can predict upon that don't ever really tell us any damn thing about what's going to happen in the future. I mean, the only really good predictor we have right now about some things is IQ, and the only damn thing that it predicts is about PhDs in some respects, but won't tell you who's going to become a Nobel laureate, and won't tell you who's going to write the next great classic novel, won't tell you certain things. And the reason it won't tell you those things is because it's only figuring out one thing. But those other things per se, in terms of a scientist who's going to win a Nobel Prize, in terms of a Rembrandt, and this is something else I want to say about this idea about universality. Leonardo da Vinci was a polymath. But we have to realize he was the exception, and that we shouldn't encourage people to be Da Vinci. Rembrandt was not a polymath. Mozart was not a polymath. Newton was not a polymath.